They zipped up the body bag at 3:42 p.m. The time of death was officially recorded, the machines turned off, and the room fell into that odd sterile silence that follows the end of a fight no one won. For the staff, it was another failed attempt. For the man on the table, it was supposed to be the end. But 8 minutes later, something happened that none of them could explain. It wasn't a beep or twitch. It was a voice, a low, hoarse whisper from inside the zipped up bag. I saw her. That man's name was Walter Henderson, a 62-year-old former mechanic from Missouri who had lived most of his adult life unnoticed, unseen, and uninspired. But what happened to him in those 8 minutes shook everyone who heard it. This wasn't the kind of man people made documentaries about. He hadn't climbed mountains or cured diseases. He lived alone, worked with his hands, and drank coffee from the same chipped mug every morning. He was in many ways forgettable. But that's the thing about stories. They don't need to start with fame to end in transformation. Walter's life up to that moment was a string of quiet disappointments. He had married young, divorced by 30, and lost custody of his only daughter shortly after. He never tried to rebuild his family. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he believed he didn't deserve a second chance. He poured himself into work. Fixing engines was predictable, reliable. Unlike people, machines didn't expect apologies or affection, but even metal rusts over time. And Walter did too. By 50, he had developed type 2 diabetes. By 55, he had lost partial vision in one eye. By 60, he was living off disability checks and had been diagnosed with early-stage heart failure. Still, he told no one. He preferred it that way. In his words, no one's disappointed if they never expected anything. But under the gruff shell was a man who, in rare moments of solitude, would speak to the air. "Emily, I'm sorry." He'd whisper to the framed photo of his daughter, now in her 30s, whom he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. On a Tuesday afternoon, Walter collapsed while walking to the corner store. A woman across the street saw him fall and rushed to his side. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. CPR, adrenaline, shock paddles. The whole protocol. Nothing worked. 27 minutes after he collapsed, he was declared dead. Then came the whisper. I saw her. At first, the nurse thought she was hallucinating. Then the bag moved. Not violently, just enough. They unzipped it, and there he was. Eyes open, tears running sideways across his temple. No one spoke. One nurse dropped a clipboard. Then Walter said it again, more clearly. I saw her. She was smiling. She forgave me. For the next several hours, Walter drifted in and out of consciousness. But one thing never changed, the story he told. He said he was standing in a field of light, not just white, but golden, warm, filled with a feeling he couldn't describe. Ahead of him stood Emily, not as the child he remembered, but as a grown woman, yet somehow still familiar. She didn't speak at first. She only smiled. And in that smile, Walter said he felt everything he'd never forgiven himself for start to loosen. Then she said, "It's not too late, Dad." And the light faded. When he awoke in the hospital, everything felt different. Not just his body, his mind, his spirit, his will. And that's when the transformation began. Walter wasn't a religious man. He didn't suddenly become one, but he did become softer, more open. Something in him had shifted. The first thing he asked for was a phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 13 years. Emily, he didn't even know if it would still work. He had rehearsed in his head 1,000 times what he'd say if she picked up. But when she answered and said, "Hello," all that came out was a breath and a choked, "It's me." She didn't hang up. They spoke for almost 3 hours. She cried. He cried. She told him she had always wondered if he even cared. He told her he had never stopped. Walter couldn't undo the past. But that call was the first thread in a tapestry he thought had long unraveled. In the hospital, he started keeping a notebook, not just medical notes, but thoughts, memories, dreams. He wrote letters to Emily, to himself, to the people he had ghosted over the years. He wrote as if every sentence was a confession and every page a new beginning. When he was discharged, he didn't go back to his old house. He sold it, along with most of what he owned. He moved into a small apartment not far from Emily. He started cooking again, not out of necessity, but because he found joy in it. He began volunteering at a community garage, teaching kids how to change oil, fix belts, rotate tires. At first, They didn't pay him much attention, but Walter had stories, and he knew how to listen. That's what drew them in. Not what he said, but how present he was when they spoke. He became a kind of quiet mentor. One Saturday after class, a teen approached him. Nervous, awkward. "Are you the guy that, died?" Walter chuckled. "That's what they say." The teen hesitated, then said something that hit Walter harder than any heart monitor ever could. "I was gonna kill myself last year. But then someone told me your story. I figured maybe I'd wait a bit." Walter didn't know what to say, so he hugged him. It was the first time in decades that he had held another human being without fear or shame. That night, Walter wrote in his notebook, "Maybe I came back to keep someone else from leaving." He didn't post on social media, didn't make videos. But word got around, people started inviting him to speak at support groups, at small churches, even at local high schools. He never prepared speeches. He just told the truth. He'd begin with, "I'm not here to preach. I'm just here to say I saw something. And it made me want to be better." People listened, not because he had fancy words, but because he had lived through what they were afraid of, regret. The hardest part, he said, wasn't dying. It was realizing how much of life he had ignored. While he was still alive, he said, "I was alive for 62 years, but I think I only really lived the last one." And every time he said it, someone in the room would cry. Someone always did. Because deep down, we all know what it means to waste time, to waste love, to waste ourselves. Walter's message wasn't that death is scary, it's that it's silent. It comes without warning. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it leaves you with 8 borrowed minutes and one last chance. He told everyone who listened, you don't need to die to change, you just need a reason. And maybe that reason is hearing a story like his. Or maybe it's realizing you still have time to write your own. Walter didn't expect life to reward him for coming back. He didn't think the skies would part or that every broken thing would suddenly be fixed. What he expected, what he prayed for, even if he didn't call it that, was a chance to do it better this time. And so he woke up every day and tried to move his body even when it hurt, tried to cook real meals, tried to smile at strangers, tried to say yes when invited and no when his old patterns came knocking. He was building a life from the ashes of his old one, and for the first time in years it felt worth it. He started attending community groups, not because he needed help, but because he thought someone else there might. He didn't dominate the room. He didn't offer answers, he just listened. And when the time felt right, he'd say something like, "I've wasted years hating myself. It never fixed anything, but forgiving myself, that gave me room to breathe." And people leaned in, because it's rare to hear truth without judgment. It's rare to meet someone who admits their failures and keeps walking anyway. Walter reconnected with people he hadn't spoken to in decades. Old friends, his brother, who had stopped speaking to him after a falling out years ago. Even neighbors he had ignored while walling himself off. It wasn't always a happy ending. One friend never responded. Another told him to stay away. But Walter kept writing letters anyway. Not for them, but for himself. To release, to let go, to heal. One afternoon, Emily asked him to come with her to a school event for his granddaughter. He hesitated. Crowds still made him anxious. But he agreed. And there, in the back row of a tiny auditorium, Walter watched a little girl sing off key and wave at him between lines, and something cracked inside him. Not in a bad way, in the best possible way. A crack that let the light in. He cried openly, shamelessly, because he realized in that moment that he had a second chance, not just with his daughter, but with life. Every Thursday, Walter started a new tradition. He called it Coffee and Confessions. He'd sit at the same booth in the same diner with a notepad and a sign that read, "Need to talk? I'll listen." At first, no one came, but then a young mother sat down one morning and unloaded 5 years of postpartum depression and fear. A widower followed the week after, a teenager the next. It grew quietly, organically, no social media, no flyers, just word of mouth when people came, because Walter didn't judge, didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix anyone. He simply gave Adam space. He later told Emily, "Maybe that's what I needed all along, not to be fixed, just to be heard." Emily smiled, tears in her eyes. "And now you're doing that for others." Word spread to a local radio host who invited Walter for an interview. Walter declined at first, nervous about being in the spotlight, but eventually he agreed. The interview was raw and powerful. Walter spoke about the field, about forgiveness, about how surviving gave him more questions than answers, but also a reason to live those questions fully. The next day, the station received over 300 calls and emails. Some shared similar near-death experiences. Others just wanted to say thank you. Walter became a quiet symbol of hope. Not a saint, not a guru, just a man who once died and then chose to live. Months passed, and Walter's days began to take shape. Around service, not in a grand theatrical way, in quiet, ordinary moments that once would have gone unnoticed, he began mentoring a small group of boys from troubled homes. They'd meet twice a week at the garage to learn not just about engines, but about responsibility, focus, and integrity. Walter didn't give them lectures. He gave them consistency. And that, for many of them, was new. One of the boys, Darren 17, had been suspended 3 times for fighting. Walter gave him a socket wrench and said, "Fix this brake caliper. No one's ever trusted you with something this important. Have they?" Darren broke down. Not because he couldn't do it, but because someone believed he could. Walter never forgot that moment. At night, he would lie in bed and replay these conversations in his head. He no longer dreaded the silence. It had become his sanctuary. Every Friday, Emily and the grandkids came over for dinner. He cooked for them, chili meatloaf, sometimes just pancakes and eggs. It didn't matter. They sat together, talked, laughed. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes the kids screamed or spilled juice, but it was life. Full, messy, sacred life, and Walter cherished it. He began writing short stories based on people he'd met. Stories of addiction, loss, resilience. Some he shared anonymously in local newspapers. Others he simply printed and kept in a folder, marked for when I'm gone. He didn't fear death anymore, but he wanted to leave something behind. Not to be remembered, but to be useful. One day at the community center, an older woman named Marlene approached him. "I heard your story from my niece," she said. "She's been clean for 6 months now. She said something you said made her want to fight for her life." Walter lowered his head, tears welling. He had never even met the niece, and yet he had helped her. Marlene hugged him tightly. "You're doing more good than you'll ever know." That night, Walter wrote, "Think we need to do big things to matter, but sometimes just surviving is the spark someone else needs." He wasn't interested in likes, followers, or viral videos. He was interested in people, in real connection, in slow healing, in meaningful presence. His motto became simple: stay, listen, love, and people gravitated toward it. He'd often tell the younger ones, "Your pain isn't a curse, it's a bridge. Use it to reach others." Walter's story began as a near-death experience, but what made it powerful was what he chose to do afterward. He didn't just come back, he woke up, and in doing so, he gave others permission to do the same. Walter's quiet influence began rippling through his community in ways he never expected. People he didn't know started stopping him in grocery stores. A nurse approached him with tears in her eyes and said her brother had watched the radio interview and checked into rehab the next day. A teenager handed him a folded note in the parking lot. It said, "You made me believe I'm not broken beyond repair." Walter kept every letter, every note in a shoebox under his bed. He didn't read them for validation. He read them when a doubt crept in, when old shadows whispered that his past still defined him. He'd take one out, unfold it gently, and remind himself, redemption doesn't erase your story. It just lets you write the next chapter. One morning, he received a letter from a woman named Linda in another state. She'd read about him in a small-town newspaper and wanted to invite him to speak at a grief support group. Her husband had died suddenly, and she said she'd been lost in silence for months. Walter didn't think twice. He packed a small bag, filled up his tank, and drove 6 hours to be there. What he found wasn't just a support group. It was a room full of people on the edge of emotional collapse. Grief, addiction, estrangement, shame. Walter didn't come with a script. He just sat down and said, "I died for 8 minutes. And when I came back, I realized I didn't want to waste another second hiding from people who might need me." They listened. Some cried, some left in silence. But the group invited him back the next week, and the week after that. He stayed in town for a month, sleeping in a borrowed RV behind a local church. Every evening, people came not for therapy, but for honesty. Walter didn't try to fix them. He just reminded them they weren't alone in their pain. He started calling these evenings circles, and slowly other circles began to appear. People who had attended his talk started hosting their own, not to preach, but to share. Stories. To build bridges from pain. To create safe spaces without judgment. Walter never claimed credit. He'd say, "Oh, I just lit a candle." You all carried it further than I ever could. He began documenting the circles in a leather-bound journal. Not for publication, just so someone someday might read about a time when strangers chose connection over cynicism. Back home, Walter noticed something else beginning to shift within himself. Not just peace, but joy, true joy. The kind that bubbles up in unexpected moments, watching his granddaughter eat a popsicle too fast and get brain freeze, hearing a song on the radio that reminded him of his wife and smiling instead of crying, opening the door to find a neighbor, returning the rake he lent them months ago with a note that read, "Thanks for being light." Walter started writing poems, little ones, observations, prayers without religion. He called them whispers. He taped them to his fridge, left them in library books, tucked them into park benches. One read, "You are not your silence. You are the sound waiting to be sung." Another said, "Time doesn't heal everything, but love gives it something to hold on to." His house became a haven for peace. No TV, no scrolling, just soft music, warm lighting, the smell of cinnamon or lemon or soup always in the air. People who visited said it felt like entering a sacred space. Not because it was fancy, but because it was intentional. Walter was building a life on purpose, not by accident, not by default, by design. On his 64th birthday, Walter hosted a gathering at the community garage. Nothing fancy, just coffee, pie, and chairs arranged in a circle. People came from different towns, some driving hours just to sit with him. No agenda, no performances, just conversation. He opened the gathering by saying, "I'm not celebrating getting older. I'm celebrating not being dead." Laughter broke the room, then applause. Throughout the evening, one theme emerged again and again: gratitude. Not for wealth, not for fame, but for time, for breath, for second chances. Walter told the group, "There's no such thing as a meaningless life, only a life that hasn't been seen yet." A woman in her 70s stood up and said, "I thought I was too old to start over, but your story made me ask, what if I'm not?" That became the heart of Walter's mission, not just helping people survive, but helping them start again. He was later invited to speak at a retirement home where several residents struggled with depression. Instead of giving a speech, he pulled up a chair and asked each person what they were proud of. Some hesitated, others cried. One man simply said, "I'm proud I'm still here." Walter smiled. "Then you've already won." He began hosting storytelling nights at local libraries. Themes would vary: loss, joy, mistakes, forgiveness. Walter always opened the night, but the microphone was for anyone. Stories poured out of people who had never felt safe to speak before. An ex-convict shared how a stranger's kindness made him choose sobriety. A single mother spoke about losing custody of her kids and fighting to get them back. A teenage boy read a poem about grief that left the room breathless. Walter sat in the back after each one, tears on his face, notebook in hand. He later told Emily, "I don't think I came back for me. I think I came back so others could speak through me." Emily, now more than just his daughter, his friend, started helping organize his events. She managed logistics, emails, even built a small website called 8 Minutes Later, where people could submit their stories and read others. It became a quiet archive of human resilience. Walter never monetized it. He refused offers to turn it into a book or podcast. "This isn't content," he'd say. "It's communion." One winter night, he stood alone in his backyard under falling snow. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you for not letting it end when I gave up." He hadn't just been given time, he'd been given purpose, and in living it, he reminded others that it's never too late to rewrite the story, even if you think the last page has already been turned. That spring, Walter was invited to a city conference on mental health and community building. He sat on a panel with doctors, authors, and psychologists, none of whom had nearly died in a body bag. When asked what advice he'd give to someone who felt hopeless, Walter leaned forward and said, "Start small, breathe, make tea. Open a window, write one honest sentence. Call someone even if it's awkward. Don't try to fix your life, just show up for the next 5 minutes." That's where healing begins. The room went silent. A therapist on the panel turned to Walter and said, "You just said more in 2 minutes than most of us do in a session." Walter smiled, not out of pride, but because he finally understood something that had eluded him his whole life. You don't need a title to have a voice. You don't need permission to matter. You don't need perfection to be useful. Later that night, he wrote one final whisper and pinned it to the door of the diner. Your scars are not shameful. They are proof you fought to stay. And as the sun rose the next morning, Walter stepped into another ordinary day, fully present, deeply human, quietly heroic, and he kept going. The older Walter got, the simpler his world became. He didn't need much, just a quiet morning, a cup of coffee, and a reason to show up for someone else. But age didn't soften his urgency. If anything, it made it sharper. He understood how fleeting time was, how easily people drifted into silence without meaning to, how regrets multiply when left unattended. So he kept moving, kept creating spaces for people to speak, kept reminding anyone who'd listen that it's never too late to begin again. One day during a community Q&A, a man in his 40s raised his hand and asked, "What if I'm too broken? What if the damage is too deep?" Walter looked at him for a long moment, then replied, "Then you're the perfect person to help someone else heal. The deeper the wound, the brighter the light that comes through when it mends." That answer was printed, framed, and hung in 3 different recovery centers. Walter never charged a fee for his talks. He never signed books or gave autographs, but his words moved through people like seeds in the wind. He began visiting prisons, sitting across from men society had written off. He didn't ask what they had done. He asked who they wanted to be now. One man, covered in tattoos and hardened by years of violence, whispered, "I want to feel something again." Walter didn't flinch. He reached out, touched the man's shoulder, and said, "Then you're already on your way back." Outside those prison walls, Walter continued to grow the 8 Minutes Later network, not in size, but in depth. Stories flooded in from people around the world who had survived suicide attempts, overdoses, trauma, people who had faced death and, like him, decided not to waste their second chance. Walter read every story. He cried over many of them. Some nights he'd sit on his porch reading by lamplight, whispering prayers for people he'd never meet. He kept a list of names in a journal titled "Still Here." It was his way of honoring the fight people waged in silence. He began writing letters to strangers again. This time, not from guilt, but from gratitude. "I believe in you," he'd write, "even if we never meet, especially if we never meet." He believed those words mattered, and somehow they always found their way to the right mailbox. One summer evening, after hosting a storytelling night at a nursing home, Walter walked a resident named Gloria to her room. She had told a story about losing her husband in the war, about never remarrying, about living with silence. Before she went in, she turned to Walter and said, "You made me feel like I lived out loud tonight." He smiled and simply replied, "That's all I ever wanted to do." Walter's hair had gone fully white now, his body slower. But his presence, his voice, had only grown stronger because it wasn't about volume, it was about truth. In his final years, Walter often reflected on how everything changed because of 8 borrowed minutes. He never claimed to understand it fully. He never wrote a book or gave a speech titled "What Happens After Death." He always said, "I don't know what I saw, but I know what it made me feel." And that feeling changed everything. Emily once asked him if he'd go back, if he'd want to see that field of golden light again. He smiled softly. "I think I carry it with me now. Every time someone tells the truth, every time someone forgives, every time someone dares to begin again." He wasn't afraid of dying anymore. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had lived the question so fully. One night, as the stars blinked quietly above his porch, Walter recorded a voice message for his granddaughter. She had just turned 16. "Don't waste time chasing perfect," he said. "It doesn't exist, but beauty does. In forgiveness, in listening, in trying again. That's where life is. That's where love is. That's where you'll find yourself when you feel lost." His voice cracked at the end, and then he laughed. That laugh, the one his daughter said made people feel safe. Walter passed away peacefully at age 68. No sirens, no tragedy, just a man going home. At his memorial, over 300 people showed up. Mechanics, teachers, former inmates, teenagers, grieving parents, addicts in recovery, elderly widows, strangers who had only met him through a letter or a story. There were no speeches, only stories. each one a ripple from the stone Walter had thrown into the waters of time. A young man stood up and said, "He never saved me. He made me realize I could save myself." Another said, "He saw me when no one else did." Someone else whispered, "He taught me that starting over doesn't make you weak, it makes you brave." His granddaughter read the whisper he had written for her last birthday. "You're here, that's enough, that's everything." And then silence, not heavy, not empty, full, sacred. Walter Henderson lived a life that began with quiet despair and ended with roaring grace. He didn't seek attention, he offered presence. He didn't preach from pulpits. He sat beside people in their darkest hours and listened. He was proof that even the most broken story can still become beautiful. And if he could do it, maybe you can too. So if this story moves something in you, don't let it fade. Leave a comment below and tell us what you're fighting for. And if you believe in second chances, in healing, in stories that remind us we're never too far gone, subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like Walter's, and one of them might be yours. So stay with us because the next one, it might just change everything.